Perhaps you have seen the historians online who have raged about the anonymous statue profile picture accounts or the history enthusiasts, the pop historians, and had some real complaints about what exactly they are up to. Or in the reverse, perhaps you have seen somebody who's a professional and seen them take some abuse from some anonymous accounts, maybe even from some pop history accounts. Today, we're going to talk about the internet controversy, the tension, the conflict between real historians and fake historians, or maybe pop historians, enthusiasts, however else you'd like to classify those who are not technically professional historians. I have with me today two professional historians and a fellow enthusiast / pop historian who will all introduce themselves shortly. What I can say is they've all been on the podcast before with their own episodes. So if you enjoy what they have to say here, you may want to check out, if you haven't before, our discussion on some of their expertise. And you will find links in the description to all of their social medias. And for David and John both, I have read both, I've read two of their books, one each, and they are both excellent. And you will find links to those in the description as well. This episode is a little bit different in that it's a roundtable discussion rather than on a particular topic. And it's really about what differentiates professional historians from enthusiasts. The incident that was something of an instigation for this conversation is something that was between myself and some PhD students and some other apparently credentialed academics on Substack. And if you care to dive into the lore on that, you can check out the previous episode where I went into detail about how these people took some things that I said wildly out of context and then proceeded to slander me. We don't really get into that here. It's not what this conversation is about specifically, which is why I recorded it in that other episode that you can go check out. And lastly, I'm doing my very best to put out these 2 podcasts a month and to keep everything free, including posting daily medieval history content. If you are feeling generous and have the resources, please consider becoming a paid supporter on Substack. You'll get access to the subscriber chat, which will give you a preview, a sneak peek on what episodes I'm about to record, and potentially the ability to have some input, maybe ask a question to the guest as well. So a little perk, a little benefit, and your support is going to help me do bigger and better projects long into the future. I have a couple big projects I'm hoping to release before the end of this year. And of course, I'm very thankful for those of you who are already financially supporting my project. Very much appreciated. So with that said, let's jump into the discussion.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Parnell. I'm a professor of history at Indiana University Northwest. My subject of specialty is the late antique Romans, and my most recent book is on Belisarius and Antonina.
Hey, hi, I'm John Hosler. I'm a professor of military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, specializing in medieval warfare, research area in the 12th and 13th centuries, but lately I've kind of been ranging across the entire period. And right now I'm writing a world history of the True Cross in war.
All right. My name is Andrew, and I'm better known as Shadows of Constantinople on both Instagram and X. I post pretty much throughout the entire Eastern Roman era, pretty much from the time of Constantine until 1453. I mean, I'm more than willing to go a little bit after that, a little bit before that, but that's my general time span. I really post just about whatever I find interesting, so it's pretty open-ended. It gives me a lot of control over what I do, and I just go all over the place with it.
So to start the discussion off, let's talk about what is a historian, because I think that'll help frame the discussion a little bit for ourselves and for the listeners. In my opinion, which you guys can obviously riff off of this or expand on it or completely override it, I suppose, if you like. I think a historian it's a difficult thing because it encompasses sort of multiple facets. There is the fact-finding sort of archaeologist detective facet of being a historian, as I understand it. That's obviously not my specialty. There's the narrative storytelling part of the cultural aspect of a historian. And then I suppose kind of unrelated to this discussion, there's another facet, which would be the contemporary recorder of events type of historian. If I was writing about current events, or as we refer to primary sources who wrote about their current events, we would sort of refer to them as historians. So I think that there's sort of maybe three facets to being a historian. And that's kind of moving in and out of those, I think, is part of what makes things difficult amongst the professional historians and the pop historians online. So we'll dive into that. What do you think, David?
Well, first, I want to say, Michael, I don't disagree with anything you said. I think those are all important aspects of being a historian. But if somebody asked me my definition of historian, I'd actually start with something a lot more simple and very broad, sort of like an umbrella that contains all of those things. So for me, a historian is simply a person who studies the past by reading primary sources appropriate to their period of interest. That's my basic definition. So it might require a little bit of explanation here for the listeners. Primary sources are texts that are written within the area that the historian is studying. So if you're studying the American Revolution, it's the Declaration of Independence, for example. If you're studying the First Crusade, it's the Gesta Francorum or the Alexiad of Anna Komnene. So if a person is actively engaged in the study of history via primary source texts, then they are, by definition, for me, a historian. Now, there may be different gradations in the level of detail and the skill with which the historian approaches primary texts, but I think that general definition sort of encompasses history work for me.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with what you said, David. Because historians interpret the past. I mean, that's our job, and a lot of people like to interpret the past, but there is a difference between reading history and sort of what we call doing history. And primary sources are the way you do history, but it falls in so many different spheres. I was just thinking of a list of different sorts of people that I would consider historians, right? And it's David and I are at university. That's kind of a traditional track. You study, you get the PhD, you go on and teach. But we have colleagues. I'm sure David knows the same thing. We people who do living history. We know that there are amateurs, particularly here in the States, who do Civil War history. Who they're not doing living history per se at a museum, but they'll dress up in period clothing. They'll recreate battles. They'll study regimental letters and accounts and those sorts of things. You have tour guides of battlefields who maybe don't dress up at all, but they know intimately. Sometimes better than the professional historians, what was going on. I remember touring Antietam once back when I lived in Maryland, and I had a terrific guide, and he knew more about that battlefield than any Civil War historian I've ever met before. But he's not a professional historian in a sense, but he's still a historian because he's looking at the records, he's looking at the landscape, he's interpreting them, right? You have research historians who never teach and publish. The Army is full of those at the Center for Military History. They write pamphlets about campaigns and operations, and they're not teaching faculty, but they're reading the sources. They're reading the transcripts of interviews from wars, putting things together. And so as you kind of go down that path, you realize there's an awful lot of people who do what David is suggesting, but I think the core of it, he's absolutely right, to engage with those pieces from the past. And we all do it at different levels. The expectation's a little different. At certain levels, using, for example, what David and I do, right? You need your Greek, you need your Latin, you need your Arabic. There are languages you must have. It's okay to do it in translation, depending on what level you're at. You get up to the PhD level, you want to be a professor, the expectations are higher. But as long as you're looking at that document and pondering it and kind of trying to unravel what's in it and comparing it and contrasting it with other documents you can get your hands on, you're doing the work of a historian.
For me, actually, when this question was first brought up to me, I was a little bit thinking that, well, part of what makes someone a historian is just having the right credentials and doing these things, which I think probably is too narrow of a definition. I do think that there are people, like you said, that have these expertise, and you could do that. You don't have to have literally a PhD, because, I mean, if you did all the same things and knew the same language and you didn't, now how rare that is worth considering. But you could still be a historian. But I actually, for fun, just looked this up on like the dictionary, and it said that a historian was an expert in history, an authority on history. And I do think those two things together might be what makes a historian, because someone could be an expert in something, but if they're not diving into the primary sources, and they're not perhaps knowing a language, if that's required, it depends what the subject is, of course. Maybe they're just an expert and not a historian, and there is probably some difference in that. Like for me, sometimes I think I have some expertise, but I'm not sure if I feel comfortable calling myself a historian, because I might have some authority, I might have some expertise, and I can look at translations of primary sources, and they might be using terms or talking about events, and I know that context, but I wouldn't be able to look at the original and get. I mean, I might see an emperor's name, so I'll be able to see some of the Greek words, like I'll know where it says Constantinople or the Romans or something like that, but I don't have the ability to go to the original form. And I do think, it's a little unfair, because if you study American history, you don't need to know another language to do that. But, in a lot of history you do. And I think that's important, is being able to go to the original source, or, a picture of it or whatever, and be able to see it. So I do think part of what makes a historian is being able to engage with it in that full way, whatever that is, depending on the field. So
I just want to say that I think it's interesting when we're talking here, right? I think some of your listeners might be expecting the professors to be a bit more limited with who they bestow the title historian on. But actually, it's John and I who seem to be willing to spread the net a little wider than Andrew or Michael perhaps here. So I just find that interesting. I don't know if it means anything, but worth pointing out.
I was thinking the same thing. You guys are maybe a little too generous, because I certainly don't necessarily think of myself as a historian, and certainly I try to bill myself online as an enthusiast. I feel like that's, I don't have the professional training. So, and really, I guess we'll maybe talk about this a little bit more, but, a big part of my goal is just to get people excited and interested. So I don't refer to myself as a historian.
One additional thing we may throw into this is everybody can you can access primary sources. You can read them. Andrew, you're right. Depending on what level you can read them at, sure. Not unlike a biblical scholar, if you can read the Hebrew and the Koine, you're doing a better job than reading a translation. One of the differences may be why you're looking at those sources. David and I don't want to speak for David, but I'm guessing we very often are seeking answers to historical questions. There are very particular things that we are trying to figure out. In one sense, in sort of the quest for truth, the quest for knowledge, that's a controversial thing these days in the academy, and has been for a while. But if the belief is that there is truth here, there is a story here, there is something important here, and I'm going to mine the sources. I'm looking for something. So not just reading about it and becoming acquainted, but actually diving in and trying to get those questions answered. Historians spend a lot of time doing that. And that is a very different thing than, I think, what you do, Michael. You say, I want to bring this to a lot of people. I want people to get excited about the past and really enjoy the stories and find something to connect with, which is great. So much of our time as academics is spent answering questions to our satisfaction, our critical and analytical satisfaction, that a lot of that work, sometimes the drawing people in, can pass us by because we've got our nose in the books for a particular reason. And I know I personally, I don't like to stop until I got my answers. It can become obsessive after a while. And so maybe that you sort of question and answer bit might help a little bit to differentiate. I don't know, it just crossed my mind.
I mean, I'll say this. Sometimes I do that a little bit. Sometimes I'll read, for example, a secondary source, and I'll say, I'm not sure if I'm fully satisfied with this. Like an example I can give is maybe reading about the sack of Constantinople in 1453. And I'll read some accounts, and I'm like, this feels a little bit softened about what actually happened. And I go to all the primary sources, and it talks a lot about, like, very consistently in every primary source, about like all the violence and enslavement and other things like that. And then you'll read the thing and they'll be like, well, it was mostly peaceful and not as well. I'm like, that doesn't match the primary sources. So sometimes I do feel like, in general, I'm pretty deferential to historians, and I go through secondary sources more. I mean, there is more of it too. And, it just depends, of course. But sometimes I do feel like I am not satisfied. I'm like, I know enough to know this doesn't seem fully right, or it's partially right, and I want to fill it out a bit more for what I'm going to talk about. So I do a little bit of that, but the degree is very big differential on what I do. It's probably a smaller part of what I do versus a main part of what you do. Mm-hmm. So that is a big factor.
John, what are the, you're saying that historians spend a particular amount of time on specific questions. What type of specific questions, or where are you getting these questions from?
Oh, well, that's they can come from all kinds of places. Very often they'll come from students. The student will say something like, why did this happen? You'll say, I don't know. Actually, I have no idea. I'm going to find out. I think for me, as I read through secondary studies and sort of see what other people are working on and get ideas for my own, from my own perspective, I tend to generate my own questions. And as well as relying on my students. And then you have to sort of pick and decide, well, what's worth looking into. I'd be lying if I said it was kind of a neutral proposition. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the term publish and perish, right? And that does factor into it. You say, well, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, but there's 3 books written about that. So if I really want to know, I'll just go read those books. And so is doing a project and they're great, and I can't wait to see what they come out with. And there is a little bit of sorting, like, is this question worth my time in terms of payoff? And I'd like to say we're just purely idealistic and say, I'm doing it for historical truth. But in the back of my mind, well, can I turn this into a conference paper? Can I turn this into an article? Can I turn this into a book? Could I develop a course around this? Maybe an elective, for some students who'd be interested. And so there's, that I think the idea is they come more or less organically as you just read and write. You think of things, and the longer you're in the game, in the business, I think the easier they come to you. But then there is a winnowing process of, okay, but now what is worth my time? What is worth my energy? Particularly as families are growing and kids are busy with all kinds of things, you realize it's a finite amount of time. And so then you have to make some decisions. And one thing I'll do is I'll open up generally a file for every idea I have, and I'll write the idea down, and it may stay there for 10 years. Now, I may never touch it again, but I put them all down so that I don't forget them. That's probably not a great answer to your question, because I think every historian has their own way of sort of coming up with ideas, but mine, they really do. I sit and think deeply, and sometimes they just come to me. And I do know if I try to force them, that does not work. So if I sit there and say, I need a topic for a next book that's just going to be an awesome book, it's not going to come to me. But the more I just read history and talk history and think about it, those things will generally be sparked by things that other people say.
So history happens in the deep thinking in the shower, is what you're saying.
Sometimes I have come up with article ideas in the shower. Yes.
And so maybe just one more quick follow-up. Do you guys think history is an art or a science?
So this is a loaded question. And if you look at the websites for various universities, you'll find history class differently depending on university. Some universities call it a humanities, which would probably be closer to an art. And some universities classify it as a social science. So, that illusion that you can sort of control it in the way you can a hard science kind of field. I think it can be a little bit of both depending on how one approaches it, right? So there are ways to do history that involve quantitative research, right? You're using statistics, you're using numbers, you're modeling those statistics to create, projects and ideas. And that can be more akin to what people do in the social sciences. And then there's ways to approach history more like an art, where you're approaching a text from a literary perspective. And that's not anything you can quantify in any way that approaches science. So I think the answer is probably a little bit of both, depending on how you approach it, sort of what interests you about history.
I think it is a bit of both to say it's an art and a science. I mean, again, if you're writing a paper about what lake core samples in Anatolia say about the Dark Ages or something, or the Arab invasions, or the plague of Justinian or whatever, to measure pollen and to decide how much agriculture was going on in the region, that's pretty scientific, and there are people who do that. I've seen it. But if how you write history is very artistic. So if you're trying to write a general history, like the New Roman Empire by Anthony Caldelis, you do have to write it in a kind of artistic way to get people to want to read it. So there isn't art in the presentation of it. I assume that when you wrote Belisarius and Antonina, there was some artistic component in how you thought about how you wanted to do it, because it's like you're trying to do a work of art in a scientific way, I suppose, which is that's how I see it. I mean, I'm not a historian, but that's how I interpret what historians who do that kind of in-depth work do. But there is a spectrum to it. Like something could be very scientific, like just a report on archaeology. It could be pretty dry. Doesn't mean boring. I just mean like dry and this is purely scientific. And something could be a little bit more just theorizing and a little more artistic. So
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I think it depends on sort of what you're doing. Methods can be very quantitative, as David mentioned, right? The old schools of economic history, just, assembling vast reams of data. And it's funny, economic history has fallen out of fashion. It seems to me AI would make it unbelievably productive today if people were to get back into it. But we can, the social science bit is the tricky part. It is because, and when you mentioned theory, Andrew, and when you start bringing theory into it, and this is something that historians have sort of broadly pushed back a little against, but has become, every year more and more popular. The more it becomes fashionable to approach a question from a particular theoretical perspective. You're imposing a model on your reading of texts. And it does become very social sciencey, where you start to say, I impose this someplace and I can almost sort of predict where I'm going to find things and what conclusions I'm going to come to. And that's always the part of it that makes me uneasy. I never liked it. I used to be in literature programs. My first 2 degrees were in literature, and I left because of theory. It really drove me out. But there are many historians who would apply this, and post-colonial theory is very big right now, and it does have the effect of, it's not scientific, but it's almost laying down rules and guidelines and nomenclature and all of these things that you're supposed to use and abide by as you go forward. And it's not scientific method, but it starts to resemble something a little bit like it. And sort of classic humanists would sort of be repelled and say, no, you read the text closely and see what you see in it, right? Don't impose models. But the imposition of models has been very, very pernicious over the last 10 years, over the last 20 years, certainly as well. But it's accelerated. And so that question has become more and more interesting as time goes on.
I see that because I feel like these models aren't really applied to all civilizations equally. I mean, again, it's easy to take this down a political rabbit hole that I don't think we're trying to go down. But I do think that you see certain empires and certain civilizations are put under a certain lens, but you could apply the same framework and come to somewhat similar conclusions from another group, but it's not applied to them. So even how these, theories are applied is somewhat of an art in terms of, because it's not being applied scientifically and uniformly, in my opinion, a lot of times. I don't remember the name, which makes me feel bad referencing it, but there was some kind of publication that even implied, it was like something about post-colonialism and Byzantine studies. And it implied even that like when the Romans retook North Africa, that it was like colonial or something. We might have engaged on that, David, a long time ago, but I was like, how you're trying so hard to make this fit the theory, but I mean, it was literally a province that had been lost like less than a century ago. I mean, retaking land is not really colonialism. And also, I think it's problematic to even try to take colonialism too far back anyway, because it just starts to not, like, the whole world would just be colonialism at that point. So I don't know. It becomes really dicey when I agree with these theories. But
quick question for this is already super interesting, and so I'm agonizing at the time spent already only on one question. But a quick question for the professionals on this. I've heard a little bit that there's some, because you brought up the theories, that there's a bit of a financial incentive to essentially novel theorize, if you will, to sort of come up with theories like a unique view, a unique angle. You're going to, maybe there's you can get a book deal for some sort of unique angle. You can get some sort of whatever research grant for some sort of unique thing. So there's maybe a financial incentive for unique theorizing. Is that a thing, or did I hear wrong?
I don't know if there's so much a financial incentive for coming up with new, unique theories, but I would say that there's probably a financial incentive to using currently popular theories and applying it to the past. So, going back to what John said about the social sciences, taking some of these theories that have become popular in the social sciences and trying to force them onto pre-modern history. There's definitely an industry in that. And we see that not just with this post-colonial stuff, but also with the most recent one is intersectionality, right? Like trying to impose that on the past. Before it, there were others, right? This is a continuing trend in the academy that if you take something that is current and fashionable and you try to put it on your field and then put out that book with, big advertising, hey, we finally applied this cool thing to the past. And often it works very poorly, but it sells and it gets attention from others. So I think that's probably the financial incentive I would say exists.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then if you sort of follow the thread to what else there is, if you ever want to have some fun, just go to it's called HNet, one of the big job boards for academics, and just look at the fields that are being advertised. They'll tell you, I was just taking a look the other day just to see what was there. And, looking for a specialist in XYZ, looking for a specialist in this or that. And that's powerful motivation if you're in a graduate program and you're saying, okay, I'm going to write a dissertation on William the Conqueror and the Norman Conquest. Oh, okay, right. It's sort of been done to death. People have looked at it forever. But what's a new way to look at it? Well, we could apply this sort of new model or new theory to it that hasn't been done yet. And because it's the hot theory, it helps me when I get out to that job market, right? Because the ads, when I came out 20 years ago with my PhD, my advisor said, he's like, you're never going to get a job. You studied English history. It's dead. It's dead as dead, right? And you didn't do the hot theories. And you could just look at the job ads and you're like, oh, I don't qualify for this. I don't qualify for this. And so part of it is there's kind of a timing thing. Like you get into grad school, you say, okay, what's hot and what's going to be hot when I get out? When I hit that market, I want to have, so for a while, I have a colleague who was just recommending to grad students he was mentoring. He said, get a minor field in gender. Just get a minor field in gender, because then you can apply for every job that advertises they're looking for a gender historian. Doesn't have to be your major field, but get some versatility in it so that you could legitimately say, yes, I'm knowledgeable in this. And that's kind of an attempt to sort of time it, right? Now, the trick is by the time you come out, maybe that's moved on and maybe there's something else and you end up kind of screwing yourself. But if you say, maybe this approach gets me into a PhD program, maybe with a funded fellowship, because it's sort of new and sexy. It gets me on the job market, gives me a fighting shot. And then once you're on the job, gives me something that my colleagues would look at for tenure purposes and say, sort of cutting edge, right? And it's hard to say no. I can understand the students are in that. And I don't know. I think sometimes they go in and say, I'm applying this theory because I absolutely believe in it. And some of them are just reading the tea leaves, and doing what's best for them. It's very difficult to come out, somebody like me, just say, I do military history, because that's dead. And you're really taking your chances and saying, do I want a job as an academic? And that's one of the calculations you sort of have to make.
Okay, so you touched on it just a little bit earlier, John, but let's talk a little bit about how we spend our time, what we do, sort of what our goals are. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more in depth about that, and then after we go around, we'll talk a little bit about research.
Just coming off a day which was filled with virtually everything except for research, I can tell you that the professorial life is the people who talk about the ivory tower and the life of the mind, and that's all great. I got to imagine there's some schools there where it's just professors thinking big thoughts and reading all day, and that must be wonderful. But I'll tell you what I did today. We had a faculty development meeting that went for about 3 hours this morning, and I helped run that meeting. So it's building a lot of slide decks and organizing and learning Microsoft Teams and broadcasting and recording, all that kind of fun stuff. And then I got back to my office, ate a quick lunch, and had to immediately deal with some curricular issues regarding learning outcomes and the wording of certain documents. then an argument about the calendar, the academic calendar, and which departments would be on what day, that sort of thing. Then I fielded some emails from past students who were looking for some assistance, looking for some to make connections between colleagues and historians working in what they were doing. And then by the time I got to the end of the day, I found myself with about 45 minutes, and I managed to write one paragraph on the Fifth Crusade. And when I was done, my office mate said, "Are you ready to get out of here?" And I said, "Yes, I am." So I think what you'll see is a lot of the time we spent in kind of a work day is on that sort of thing. And it's summertime, which means that the teaching was not included in this. There was no teaching today. We don't start up for a couple of weeks. Once that starts, then you're talking teaching prep, reading for teaching to inform your lectures, advising students, thinking about assessments, grading, all of that good stuff mixed in with all of that service work, faculty development, et cetera, et cetera. And then you hope that you have some time to do the fun historian stuff, to read for your projects, to write, to throw together a conference panel. I've got 3 abstracts for conferences I'm supposed to be writing. I haven't gotten to a single one of them. I would like to do that. I was hoping this week, and it's not going to happen. I just realized that this afternoon. I'm like, that is not going to happen. That's a next week thing. A lot of our day is not spent technically doing history. It is spent helping to shepherd the historical enterprise of our departments, colleges, and universities.
Well, what I do looks fairly different. I mean, I do some of those things like emails and stuff, but it's because I have a completely, I have a career that's unrelated to Shadows of Constantinople, because this is not my job, and the X payments are definitely not that good. I can assure you of that. So my day, in terms of what I do with the history, is a little bit more scattered. So, like, honestly, a lot of times the first thing I do when I wake up is I check into things and I try to post something, because on some part of this is a game that you want to make sure you're always posting something so you're part of the algorithm. That's not really like what I do in terms of like the main reason. Like, that's not my favorite part of it, but that is a little bit of the game that you got to play if you want to post on social media. But I find time, like maybe at lunch, if I have some extra time, I might pull up an ebook on my phone and just start looking through something and read something. And maybe I don't write anything, maybe I do, depending, but it gives me some ideas. But a lot of times in the evening, I set aside some time, maybe before I go to bed, for like an hour or something, where I write a thread or read. Well, it's a mix of both, no matter what, because I always source my threads. I don't just like write them off of Wikipedia or AI. So it's always sourced somehow. So I do have to kind of make a sacrifice, because it's not my job. So it is something I have to plan, like, okay, when am I going to write some content today? And like, there are times that you're like, oh, because it's not my job, it's a little hard. You're like, I had to do this, I had to do that. And like, it almost feels like a pressure. But again, you can do things like even reuse old content on those days. Now, it's not as fun for me, but keep something going out. But it's something I have to really try to get myself to find time. But it sounds like you have the same problem, in the sense that you have all those other things you have to do as part of your job. So your challenge is different, but you also have to like try to find time for the part that you really want to do. But I guess for me, that's like, because I decide all aspects and all topics of what I do, that is just the main part for me. So
yeah, it sounds very similar. And what I would say is, and none of it is to complain. I love my job. It is a fantastic job. But I think that's, part of it is you're keeping it going, and you're getting that stuff out there, because there is it's about the reading, it's about doing history, but it's about the history as a discipline, history as an area of study, and it needs to be fostered, it needs to be defended, it needs to be continued. The next generation needs to be trained. And all of those things are part of that. And so none of it's bad. It's just stuff where you sit there and you say, man, I'd really love just a couple hours to just kick back in the chair and just read these 2 chapters. And what you do is you find in the ebb and flow, and I'm sure you find some days you get more time than others, right? Some days I walk in and I've crossed every administrative duty off my list, and I look around and I said, I get all day to write. Oh, what a great day. And that does happen.
John did a great job of sort of personalizing what the life of a professor is like. So I just want to talk a little bit about it generally as well, to sort of demystify it for the listeners, because I think there is this conception that professors do get all this time to just sort of think and read and write, and we publish all these books. And the truth is that professors are sort of one part teacher, one part researcher, and one part sort of bureaucrat. if you add up all the things we do, so professors go through reviews, and whenever we go through reviews, we have three buckets of our work we talk about: research, teaching, and service. And the way we divide up our time in an average day or an average week looks different depending on what kind of university we're at. So I think that's another important thing to emphasize, that the type of professor that most listeners are probably most familiar with are those very distinguished professors at research-intensive universities, from elite private schools like Harvard to sort of big name public flagship universities like the University of Michigan, just to throw out a couple of examples there. But those professors are actually a minority in our field. So not just history, but any academic field. Something like maybe 20 to 25% of all professors work at heavy research-driven institutions like that. The majority of professors work at smaller, sort of generally less prestigious public regional schools or small liberal arts colleges or even community colleges. And there's a huge difference in how we spend our time depending on what university we're at, what type of university we're at. So just to give a rough example, professors tend to divide up their workload by how much they teach. And we do it by how many courses we teach a semester. So at a primarily teaching-centered university, a professor is typically expected to teach about 4 classes a semester, maybe 5 if it's really teaching intensive. Our colleagues at those elite, prestigious research universities maybe teach 2 courses a semester, maybe only 1 if they have a special distinguished chair or something like that. So that's sort of like the rough difference in how teaching is divided up. And then when you're not teaching, you're doing some kind of service to your university. You're sitting on these committees. You're presenting at meetings. You're sending emails, the kind of stuff that John was talking about. And after your teaching and your service are done, then whatever time is left, you're cramming in your historical research or doing that deep reading and deep thinking. And if you're lucky, it adds up for me to maybe 20% of my week. If it's a bad week, it adds up to 1 to 2% of my week, depending on the kind of expectations I have elsewhere. So we end up in different situations depending on where we work. And I like to think that some of our colleagues, at these prestigious research-intensive universities are actually spending a lot more time doing research than maybe John or I are. But the vast majority of history professors don't have that kind of lifestyle. It's the one most prominent in the mind's eye because those are most of the historians you've heard about that write the greatest number of books, like Anthony Caldelis that Andrew mentioned earlier. But they're a small minority of overall professional historians.
And I don't have too much to add as far as the daily grind goes from what Andrew said. It's very similar for me, just reading and trying to post. But one thing that I will add is that I think one of the ways in which our avenues of what we do is different is that for Andrew and I, a big part of what we do is audience building, which is sort of that treadmill that he's talking about. And, because we don't have, let's say, a professional position or like a book deal or that sort of thing, our actual history stuff is sort of based off of the audience that we can build on something. I mean, the amount of people who watch this podcast is going to be relative to how well I build an audience in the time between, I guess when I started, but between now and when the podcast releases. And then, of course, promoting the podcast and things like that. If I was just to produce something like this podcast or any other history, any sort of, like I recorded that audiobook, the Dueling Stories audiobook, anything that you produce, if you don't also build an audience, which this is sort of, where the traditional publisher would come in for, on the more professional side, where, the publisher handles your marketing and promotion, then nobody would listen to my audiobook. So in order for me to quote unquote do history at all, it sort of requires me to do audience building, which requires obviously the posting. And I think this is probably where the enthusiasts or the pop historians sort of diverge from the professional historians in a way, because in order to audience build, it requires you to somewhat tap into the zeitgeist. Social media now is obviously saturated, and there's a lot of competition. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that means that you should say something stupid or lie or make things up, but you also do have to say things in such a way that creates some engagement, that creates some conversation, that creates somebody thinking something. And so that, of course, may lead me to make a corny post once in a while. It may lead me to say something that's a little controversial once in a while, but you have to do those things in order to audience build, which is why a lot of people who, this is not without value judgment, take themselves very seriously, or, whatever, or who don't want to engage in that for whatever reason, have a harder time building an audience, because you sort of have to engage with that in order to build the audience, just because of the saturation and competition. So it's just something a little bit different on our end, as far as, sort of having to keep that treadmill going, which also then there is an incentive to, which, I obviously resist as much as possible and do my best to be factual, but there is, of course, the temptation to say stupid things or just say things to get people to comment on your post. And as Andrew said, there's not really much good in sort of torching your reputation for the ad money, because basically, unless you're doing porn or politics on X, you're not making any money. So, but anyway, I think that's sort of an interesting difference, I guess, between us. If anybody has anything else to add.
Yeah, Michael, I think that is interesting, just to listen to you talking about that, right? Audience building or creating engagement, or, as Andrew mentioned, daily posting. I just wanted to point out that one of the interesting differences is not only that you guys need to do that, but that we as professors don't have that built in anywhere into what we do, right? Like it doesn't fit into any of those buckets I really mentioned. So there's not really any incentive within academia that encourages professors to sort of reach out to the general public and audience build and do the kind of things you're talking about. So I think this is another place where we're sort of ships passing in the night, where we're just the incentives are structured differently between enthusiasts and academic historians.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think that's because we have our audience already. It's our students. That's the audience, and we know they're there, and they're going to be there, and well, hopefully they show up for class. They'll be there in the classroom, and that is who we've pitched our product in a sense of, here's the catalog entry, the history of early Byzantium, right, with Dr. Parnell, right? Students sign up for it. That's the pitch. They're there to hear that, and then that's the audience he delivers to. And those of us who do, I don't do it, but I've got some friends who do the sort of distance education, the online teaching. Sometimes their audiences are much bigger, but it's the same thing. They've come to, it's sort of the old medieval early university model. Peter Abelard standing on a bridge, and here come the people to hear Abelard's wisdom and wit, and if you're Eloise, maybe date him, but that's the audience, and that is, contractually, that is who we are supposed to care about. Number one, that is the most important thing of our jobs. And David mentioned the difference between us and some of these other universities, where frankly it's not. The research output is more important. You can tell professors who never teach the freshman survey to 100, 200, 300 students, who teach one graduate seminar a year and then take a sabbatical. And I don't begrudge them any of those things. I would love to be at Princeton. I mean, it would be unbelievable. So I'm not, besmirching them, but I'm saying in their worlds, it's even less of a draw for an audience, because they are there to turn out research. Whereas we have students we are educating. And we are supposed to be getting them to educational goals. And that takes so much of our time, frankly, whether we're designing the course, revising the course, teaching the course, helping students, grading. Building something bigger is, I think about it, I'm like, oh, how could I do that? It's just, where is the time? And certainly it can't take more time than what I'm devoting to my students, or I wouldn't be fulfilling the ethics of my position. And at the end of the day, what I really got into the job for, which is to teach the students in front of me. So it's interesting. I really like your comments, Michael, because it's you're building that audience, and in some sense, we have an audience. I don't want to say it's given to us, because good teachers have reputations and bad teachers have reputations, and your course can be big or small. But it's sort of, here's the menu, the students get admission, they sign up for classes, you walk in and there are your students. And that work is sort of done for us.
I would wonder if this intersects for some people, where perhaps some historians do want to build an audience for similar reasons, like because they are writing a book. So I mean, there's so many books published that if you want people to go to Amazon and buy your book, I mean, it depends what you publish. There's going to be some very niche publications that cost $100 that are never going to be bestsellers. But for some people, probably it is an incentive for at least a certain subset of professors uh, to cultivate an audience. I do think that professors have one advantage that, for example, they can go on a circuit of podcasts and they can use their credibility as a professor to perhaps get on those things in a way that if I wanted to promote something like, well, if you're just Shadows of Constantinople with 500 followers, not a chance. But if you have a bigger audience, perhaps. So, but I do think you do notice more professors going on things like podcasts and doing some social media. So I could see some overlap for a certain set of people there.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to pretend that we have no incentive at all. Like, we can't have certain incentives that are still on the small side. None of us, even if we promote our books to the best of our ability, is making the kind of money on those books that's going to allow us to change our lifestyle. But I do personally. If you want to take me as example, I did plenty of podcast appearances for Belisarius and Antonina. I worked with Epic History TV as a consultant. I did everything I could to get word about my research out. But basically, all of that was because I wanted people to know about it. It wasn't encouraged by my university. I received no extra reward from my university for doing that work. Right. That didn't fit neatly into one of those categories under which I'm evaluated as a professor. So I think that's an interesting distinction. Like, we do that kind of stuff because we want to, and maybe it benefits us a little personally, but it's largely our pro bono work, I guess, is the way I'd put it.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to jump in and clarify. I wasn't meaning I agree. I know you guys only get I don't know the details, but I know you don't get, if someone buys a $30 book, I know you don't get $30. I know that's not how it works. But I guess I mean, there's an incentive just knowing people listen to it. I mean, even if I write a post and I really liked it, there's some posts I'm like, it was actually one of my favorite to write, and you're like, not that many people liked it. And you're like, it's not because I'm not going to get as much ad revenue or something. I'm like, I just wish more people read it, and then I do something silly and a bunch of people look at it. I'm like, all right. But there is some certain incentive that doesn't have to be financial. That you wrote that book, you like the book, you want more people reading it, just will make you feel better, even if you didn't get any money off of it. I assume because it's something you're proud of, and I mean it's going to be way more on the scale of a book. I mean, I guess I'm doing micro dosing of this, but with the way I do content. But for a book, knowing 1,000 more people wrote it because you did all that stuff, yeah, it probably doesn't translate to paying off your mortgage, but it probably does feel good in its own way, and that's a good incentive. That's not a bad incentive. I mean, I think it's a good thing.
Everybody wants their work read, right? And I know whenever somebody says, "Oh, I read your book," and my response is always just, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I think it makes me happy that people want to read history, and I think we would all like bigger audiences for our ideas. You spend a lot of time on these books, and sometimes it feels like my social media game is so poor. I'll spend 3 years writing a book. It'll come out. I'll put out a couple posts about it, and then it's like, that's it, and you hope people you read it and enjoy it and engage with it. But David's right. There's there's no particular incentive to do that. Our institutions are happy when it happens. They're more than happy to kind of fly the flag and say, hey, look at this interview, or look at this. This is great. But it is on us. And Michael, you mentioned the publishers. There is the difference between the rich and the poor when it comes to publishing is significant. I got if you'll indulge me a little story, I sit on 2 best book award committees, right? So I get piles of books every year. best books in military history, medieval military history. And, and I got one from a major publisher that we're talking, one of the top 5, one of the big ones. And it was an advanced copy, and it had their marketing plan on the inside. And I had never seen one of these before. And I was reading through just the, 15-step plan they had to get this book out. And I was just shaking my head, said, you cannot compete with this. You can't. Most publishers don't do this. The ones that got the bucks, the big ones, they're going to make that book into a bestseller. The other ones, you really hope it does well. It pops and somebody notices. Did you say the right thing? Your post goes viral. I've never had a post go viral. I don't even know what that feels like. And you hope that will happen, but I suppose our expectations are probably much more modest in that regard.
I can tell you what it feels like. It feels like being a prom queen. Let's get into a little bit about what we do for research, and we'll let you go ahead and start with that, Andrew.
So for me, what I do for research is definitely going to be kind of like I said before for you guys with like publishing. I mean, like it's kind of microdosing. Like you're trying to set aside time for this long haul to make, even if you're making an article and it's not a book, it's still like a long project. You have to go through a lot of things for it, So for me, it's more microdosing. So for me, it's more of a daily thing where I'm like, okay, some of my research is to find what I want to post about. So sometimes I have an idea in my head and I say, okay, like I really want to write about the Fourth Crusade. I'm going to gather up all this stuff and I'm going to go through it. And that's one type of research. But sometimes my research is like, I just want to find something. And you find things in a unique way by doing that, by not having a preconceived, like I've literally just opened books randomly to find things before too. And then of course, like once I find my topic, then that could drive further research. So I might just find, a paragraph in a more general history book. And I say, okay, I want to learn more about this. And I'm going to gather up the best books I have on that and go see if I can find some articles. It really depends. But for me, I'm constantly diving in and out of books because of the nature of, I guess, of what I do. It's all over the place. So my research is all over the place because, I could be posting about Justinian one day and I could be posting about Constantine the 11th and the next day, and then I could be posting about Basil II the next day, or I could be posting about the population of Constantinople. It's all so different that I'm always hopping in and out of books. So I'll admit that it's hard for me to read an entire book straight. I don't know if that's true for you guys, where you're looking for the information for whatever you're writing. You want to source some part of it. I'm always diving into things and finding little pieces of it and trying to find something interesting. Another aspect of my research that I have to really consider is visuals. It's not the most important thing to me, but I've really noticed that it's really important to people. Like sometimes I'll spend all this time writing something, and I'm very concerned with that writing being accurate. And someone will be like, "Oh, well, this picture is not accurate," and I'm like, "Well, the picture to me wasn't the information. It was just like to attract your attention." But I mean, it's really important for people. So I actually wish it was a little less important for people, but it is. So I actually have to think about that. I got to do some research to find that. And of course, if I can make it accurate, I will. But I do, for any post that's like serious, I do research because I always try to put like a source, and I kind of borrow your, historian's credibility, because if I can put the source, I find that makes my content better than I see a lot of content that I'm like, I'm not sure there is a source for that, or what it is. But so that's a lot of what I do. Finding something interesting, that's a big part. I got to entice people. So that's a driving factor of my research compared to you guys, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess I'll approach this question from two angles. First, how I do research, and then how we write about that research, because I think they're related, but they have sort of different outcomes, right? So the way I teach my students, anyway, when I teach historical methods, how do historians work, is that historians first engage in a new subject by going to some kind of big reference work. Maybe something as basic as a historical encyclopedia, or in my field, mine and Andrew's field, the Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium. Very commonly a good starting point for a new area. So if somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I want you to write something for me on something I've never done before, 7th century Byzantine bishops," right? I've never done anything on that, right? So I'd probably go and look up some entries in the Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium just to get started. And then after that reference work, I tell my students, you then drill down to more specific secondary sources. So this is works by other modern historians on the subject that you're interested in. So you see what has been said recently about the period of time or the subject or the event or the individual that you're interested in. After secondary sources, then you drill down to the primary sources, start sources written during that time about the period you're interested in, maybe by people who lived through something, who were eyewitnesses to something, or something like that. You read these primary sources. And after all of that, you're thinking and you're trying to come up with an interesting original argument. So this all might be preceded by having a question, like John was mentioning earlier in our discussion. Maybe you have a question that prompts you to go down that rabbit hole, and that might be the genesis of an argument. Sometimes you have just a subject. You're going to write on this, and you got to come up with an argument after you read all of it. So you hope something sort of pops out at you while you're reading. And then after all that reading and thinking, we sit down to write something about it. And this is fundamentally what history work is for all of us, right? Not just for professional historians, but for enthusiasts as well. We write in different formats. We all write, so that this is the core to the discipline of history is writing. And as academic historians, we write talks to give. We call them conference papers. We write short form pieces called journal articles. Sometimes we write book chapters, and then our big projects are books or monographs, single authored books. So what we write depends on the kind of material we've come up with in reading. And some material is naturally shorter, and so it fits in one of those shorter mediums, and some is naturally longer and fits in one of those longer mediums. And last thing I'll say is that some of the stuff we write is absolutely intended to be read primarily by fellow specialists in the discipline of history. And I lately have been trying to sort of swim against the tide on that and try to make most of my stuff written that can be read by more generally interested readers of history who want to know about it. But I'll be the first to admit that that's not always the case in our field, that there's a lot written primarily for other specialists that is highly inaccessible for people who are not specialists within the field. So this is something that happens. So almost the reverse of the kind of stuff that Andrew and Michael are talking about, where they're interested in engagement and what can catch people's attention. Some academic historians are literally writing things that is not going to catch anybody's attention except for other academic historians.
Yeah, and that's like any academic discipline, right? I have an old friend who used to get on my case about that. The specialist works written in journals that are impenetrable. And I said, I got it, right? But do you criticize physicists the same way, right? Do you go after the chemists for that kind of stuff? No, you don't, because that kind of specialized work has to be done to build up the fundamentals of the fields, right? But I absolutely agree with David. At some point, you can spend your life in the weeds, but I think to service the discipline and to keep it alive, you have to reach out to the bigger parties. You just have to. I think if you lock off yourself within the tower, if you want to call it that, or within the specialized journals, then you're never going to reach the stakeholders who, unfortunately for the humanities, are key to your survival. You are just one state assembly vote away from your faculty lines being cut and your department being downsized. When people say it's all about STEM and why do we read about the past? That's not going to help anyone get a job. And, all of those kinds of trend lines you hear out there, which we shake our heads and we say, well, that's ludicrous, right? Well, okay. But if you lock yourself away, that you're going to feed that kind of attitude. So yeah, absolutely. I agree. You have to reach out. When I research, I love hearing how people do it differently because everybody does it differently. I go right to the primaries. And usually because I've got something rattling around in my head and I will just say, I wonder if so-and-so says anything about this. And I'll look at it like, no, they didn't say anything. Thanks a lot, jerk. Right. And you put it aside and I wonder if so-and-so says it, and all of a sudden you see something, you're like, ooh, interesting. I never knew they talked about that. And that sort of leads me then into, I wonder if anybody's ever looked into this before. And half the time they have, and they've written the definitive article and you're never going to best it. And it's amazing and it's everything you need. And then you say, well, that's great. Well, now I know something I never knew before and I'll file that in my bibliography. But the special moments are where you look at it and you say, I don't think anyone's approached this from the angle that I'm approaching it from. I don't think anybody's ever looked at this before. And those are great moments. But then there's all of these cascading waves of you. David said you have to look at everything. I mean, you really have to, I think, for the positions we're in, the expectation is, and I think this is, I had jotted this down as maybe, Michael, you had kind of talked in our chat back and forth, kind of the differences, maybe the tensions, and we can get to that between, different sorts of historians, right? One of the expectations on us is basically that if we haven't looked at everything, we've tried to look at everything on a certain topic. And that means sometimes it can get ludicrous. It could mean that one 4-page article in the German Festschrift that came out in 1967, and there's only 10 copies in the world, right? But that's an article on my topic. I need to get my hands on it and see what was in there. And this is one of the things that makes our research take so long, right? It takes forever to track this stuff down. You say, well, we don't have that book in the, can Interlibrary Loan get it for me? I was looking at one 14th century Arabic chronicle. You could not buy the book anywhere in the world. Like, it was not for sale, period, at any price. You could have had $1 million and there was no book for sale. I said, how am I going to get my hands on this? It took forever to get a copy, right? So I think, so research, I spend a lot of time wallowing in those primary sources. And then when I think I'm onto something, and, I don't know if it's the spidey sense or whatever it is, just I think I've got something here. And then it's an awful lot of time confirming that it has or has not been covered in the fashion that you're thinking about. And that takes a lot of time. And like you said, if you find out it has been, great, bully for them. And if it hasn't, that's when, for me anyway, it starts to get really exciting. And history starts to get really, really fun for me, because then I say, I've got something. Everyone has missed this or didn't care. Maybe it's not important, right? But I've got it, and I'm gonna track it down, and it becomes a great detective story for me. And that's when I start to really enjoy it.
Mine is a little bit different, since I'm maybe a little bit newer to the historical scene, if you will. The top 2 shelves here, minus 4 books, is my stack of purchased or gifted and not yet read history books. So I'm a little bit behind on the to read. And for me, it's really just, whether it's primary sources or books written by historians, just trying to catch up and go through things, which then that informs my content. And then, hopefully it's things that are kind of, I should say it is things that are usually relative to sort of longer historical project goals that I have of things that I'm putting together. So, various readings on, let's say, the Third Crusade. I went through, and I got an Audible account, so I could also be sort of cramming in audiobooks on the side. Like, I just went through a 30-hour audiobook on Charlemagne, just because I didn't really know much about Charlemagne. And I figured, he's obviously pretty important. And, but the other thing too is that sort of being an enthusiast means that my period of study, if you will, is 1,000 years, which is pretty long. So there's a lot to sort of, obviously I could focus if I wanted to. I could just be the Charlemagne guy, or I could be the Clovis guy, I guess, if you will. I could be the Alexios guy. You could be the Alexios guy, Andrew. But I just have a lot of catching up to do. So for me, it's really, I try to just go through full books and try to get the context and go through things, which that informs my content. If you see my content, you can kind of take a pretty good guess at what I'm reading, because I'll post little tidbits as I go. It's sort of a hand-in-hand thing. I could kind of study and get some content off of it.
I noticed when you guys were talking about your research that you have to think about whether or not somebody has already done it. And that is one of those things that must be a little frustrating to come up with some idea. Like, sometimes comparison is the thief of joy, you could say, that you have to think like, oh, someone else already had this idea. Even if they did it in a different way than you, it might still kind of thwart your effort. You might think, I should just come up with something else. And whereas for me, I could be like, someone's probably written something about this, but I'm still just going to see what, Michael Italiati said and write something about it, whether I don't have to think about whether or not someone else did or not. There's a certain autonomy and freedom that we have on the social media side that you guys don't, because it's a totally different framework. So I do think that it's a little bit liberating for us in a way.
We're sort of we have this expectation of originality in what we do as academic historians, not just the completeness that John mentioned, but that we're saying something new about whatever we're saying. Even if it's a small twist, it's something new that you're adding to the accumulated body of knowledge. So I think that's a little bit. This harkens back to Michael's answer at the very beginning, talking about what a historian is, right? So this is the part of an academic historian where we have to have original research. We have to add to the body of knowledge. We are storytellers, but we're not just storytellers. We have to add on to that in some way and leave a legacy, if you want to put it that way, which makes us a little bit different than an enthusiast who just gets to tell cool stories that interest them and that they think will interest other people.
Yeah, well, wait till I come up with my novel theory of why Saladin's overrated. And maybe this is a little more for our professionals here, but of course, you can weigh in if you like, Andrew. What is the value or the value proposition of the professional historian? Obviously, I think, from my opinion, obviously being able to read like a translated primary source, for example, would be one extremely good value proposition. And then obviously books that are well sourced on those is another example that are even more accessible than the primary source. But maybe you guys, if you have any thoughts on that, on the value or the value proposition of the professional historian.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd start with sort of just very broad, big picture that all of us are here because we believe that the study of history is worthwhile, that it adds something of value to society, right? That you want people in society that can tell us something about the human past, tell us something about ourselves by looking at what our predecessors did, tell us something about the human condition. This is a net benefit to society to have somebody that can do this, right? But as we've talked about, it's something that is very time intensive. Being a historian is not necessarily terribly expensive in other ways, right? We're not like hard scientists, like chemists that need to buy a lot of lab equipment and run experiments. But it's expensive in terms of time, in terms of labor. And so, as you guys have mentioned, right, the fact that you have to work other jobs and that you can only devote so much time to your work as enthusiasts of history. I think in a big picture sense, it's useful to society to have professional historians somewhere who are paid to think about history and paid to write about history. Now, we can have all sorts of arguments and quibbles about like what the right number of those professional historians is. How many should society pay for? I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's useful to have somebody that does it. And this has been recognized, throughout recorded history. We can go through all those figures we mentioned, Charlemagne, Alexis. They all supported and patronized, historians in their own time to do this kind of work. So this is not a new thing to be saying this. So I think we start that with that big picture thing. But then I think if you're talking about value specifically from academic historians, in addition to those things you mentioned, Michael, which are important outputs, if we want to put it in sort of economic terms of academic historians, simply that not only do academic historians do this historical research, but they teach how to do this historical research to the next generation. So, I sometimes think of us as passing on the flame of historical research, which has existed at least since Herodotus, that has been passed down generation to generation. One older historian of generations teaching the next generation of historians, so that this line of inquiry and thought doesn't get extinguished. So, these are big picture, maybe almost too philosophical ways to answer your question, but that's how I think of it.
Yeah, I like that. And I had scribbled down a note. I said, yeah, teaching. It's that's, and I think, teaching the next generation of historians certainly is also teaching and training, right? In the grad programs, and this is how you do it. But also just teaching students who aren't even history majors, who aren't necessarily all that enthralled with the topic, that the discipline has a purpose, it has a relevance, it has an importance. Passing that down, it's not always self-evident that the past can help us, and doing that. And I think that's sort of one of the greater services we provide when we do it conscientiously, when we try to do it our best, when we try to get students to absolutely love it. Mine is, this is, depends on where you're teaching and what the purposes you're teaching. I mean, we have at my school a very particular reason for teaching for having professional historians. We are trying to teach officers to use history to inform their professional judgment, so they will be better officers. So they will make better choices when they're in command, when our country's at war. And so, there's sort of what we would refer to as applied history, right? There's an academic study, but then there's also this application. There's a reason we're doing this, because we think it's going to help. And so I think that is something that the professional historians, they bear a great responsibility. I mean, we really do. We ought to be doing it to the best of our abilities and doing it as well informed and, well situated as we can, and earnestly assessing fairly, teaching well, advising well, because those are big duties. I think most of us take pretty seriously. I know there's some professors today, it seems like they just got the job to have a sinecure, and to, spout off political ideas or things. But, and I've had colleagues that are like that. I'm sure everybody has, ranting and raving and that sort of thing in the classroom. But most of us, we go in and say, this is a very serious business. He unfortunately, died a couple of years ago, but one of the greats in my field, Bernie Bachrach, one of the deans of medieval military history, he used to get on my case because I don't like to wear ties in the classroom. And he would say to me, he said, John, history is a very serious thing. Wear a tie. It's a serious thing that we're doing. And I'm like, one of the greats is telling you to do it. And you're like, okay, Bernie, I'll try putting on a tie. But he was right. He said, the burden is heavy. It's very serious. We have a lot of fun with it because we enjoy it, but it's something we need to do. I would throw in something else too, something that we maybe do. And I don't want this to sound, it's going to sound a little arrogant, and I don't want it to sound arrogant, but I think it's bringing rigorous method to the study of history. In a sense, kind of showing, I don't want to say how it's done because there's a lot of ways to do it, right? But good systematic methods for doing it right? So how do you closely read a text? How do you contextualize a text? How do you cross-check and reference to suss out mistakes? How do you evaluate bias in a source, right? How do you find the exaggerations? How do you tamp them down? How do you ascertain the truth when there are multiple voices all claiming the same thing? And I don't think we're always the best necessarily at finding that truth, but in terms of method and how to do it in a good, serious, comprehensive way, I think is a good thing that professional historians can lend to everyone in the historical community. Not that everybody will be imitating what we do, because as we've said, it takes forever, right? But so the idea is, okay, so you've got a chronicle, you talked about Charlemagne, right? So you pick up and you read Einhard. Great. Fantastic, right? Einhard says all these things about Charlemagne, and it's very easy to get swept away in that and say, oh, wow, these are great stories. Charlemagne did this and that. And then, the historian comes in and says, well, he specifically says he's imitating Suetonius. Well, what does that mean? Well, he was sort of the propagandist of the late Roman Empire, and he was writing in a certain way to capture attention. Oh, so there might be some exaggerations here. Okay, and now who was Einhard? What was his background? Who was he writing for? Is Charlemagne going to read the things that he writes? Does he have the ability to censor? And just asking all those kinds of it's really critical thinking that we're doing. If we can serve to kind of do that right, I think we're doing a service to everybody else. What drives me crazy is when I see historians who neglect doing those things, going in when they should know better and just uncritically accepting everything they say and refusing to do the compare contrast and these other sorts of things. And they'll get caught out by it. It happens invariably. The book review comes out and says, well, here's a person who believed their sources a little too literally because, as we know, this part has been disproven. That guy never existed. And you're like, oh, burn, right? You didn't do your homework. So I would say, I don't know if rigor is the right word for it or if method's the right word for it. But certainly showing, how have historians worked in the past? What are we currently doing now? Maybe how could we do it better in the future? And hopefully people might take something away from that.
I would love to just say I echo that you guys provide the methodology, because someone like me can, read a primary source like, I don't know, Nikitas Koniathis, and like he does, there are agendas there, and like, yeah, I could just take, you could take it for face value, but there is, it helps to read secondary sources that you don't have to 100% take what they say if they assert that he has a certain bias, but having that in mind when you read it to either be like, it does kind of seem like that, or partially true, or whatever. You have to weigh it on every. Sometimes it's hard to prove 100% what their biases are, but to be aware of it, have it on your radar, the methodology is important. And I know earlier you talked about teaching. I do think that's really important. I mean, I don't have a lot of historical training. I have a undergraduate degree in history, so I did I dabbled in it, and I do think it kind of it does help. I think that you get familiar with, like you said, diving down where you find the general source, and then you look in the references and see you narrow it down to what you want to find. That does help me even now. Of course, I don't have to follow any of those rules, but it does help me. And I think it did help me feel more confident about writing history, just even doing a little bit. And of course, the more you do, that's going to scale up. I think one of the biggest values that historians bring is, like, you say rigor and methodology, but it's also like this sustained momentum. And like you guys mentioned, leaving a legacy. So, if my account got deleted, all right, well, that's it. But you build on each other and you publish things that, I mean, no one could, even pay attention to your book now. Maybe in 20 years, someone important cites it and it gets it some new attention. There's books that were written 70 years ago that were really important. Now someone built on their book and made a book that's better, but that book would have never existed if they didn't write that book. So like this sustained momentum and refinement. I know we mentioned the issue that sometimes there's a little bit of over refinement, but there's always pros and cons to everything. But overall, that sustained momentum is something that I think that the compartmentalization of, like, me and him doing what we want on our accounts could never create. And it also creates something that we can use to do what we do also. And also, another value I think is, like, when I do what I do, I borrow, like I said, the credibility of real historians. So if someone says, like, oh, well, I think that you're just being biased, and I could be like, well, no, I got it from here, and like, it's really, I don't see any evidence that they're biased. I can at least, and then if other people come along, they'll be like, well, it doesn't seem like he's being biased. And I'm trying my best not to be. I'm sure it's impossible not to be biased to some minor degree, no matter what it is. But I do think so. Like, even people who are dabbling in an amateur way, they can borrow the credibility of real historians.
All right. So maybe in the interest of time, we'll table the future of the professional historian for now, so we can get to why is there tension on the internet between the pop historians and the professional historians? What do you think about that, Andrew?
Well, I mean, honestly, for me, I'm probably not the number one best person to answer this, in the sense that it hasn't happened to me a lot. I don't really get into things with professors. I mean, I'll admit that I show them a slightly above average deference, even if they espouse a theory I don't 100% agree with, because, like, I do have respect for the field, I guess. I had professors I didn't 100% agree with in college and stuff like that, but it doesn't mean that you didn't enjoy talking to them or learning from them. So I have some respect with them. So my default setting is a little bit more, open to that. But also, I think it depends what you post about. There are certain hot topics that really attract criticism from historians. So if you're posting about something that really gets into, like, that intersectionality, those things that we talked about, those models that are being applied, and you fall afoul of those, you're more likely to get into conflict. Like you could have a bunch of people hate on you because you used Anglo-Saxon the wrong way or something like that. But like that doesn't happen to me. I mean, every once in a while you'll see someone act like you shouldn't say Byzantine, but there's not really, or you should say Byzantine instead of Eastern Rome. There's not many historians that actually do that now. It's mostly people who aren't historians that do that. Maybe a couple, like, smaller ones. But so I don't fall afoul, but I observe it. So to me, it seems like when you fall afoul of these more, theory based, that we talked about earlier, that perhaps also have a political component at times, and that could be also a political component on the social media side too, where now you have these clashing political narratives, and like perhaps the professor feels certain people have like this undercurrent that they think that they're using history for. So like I see that a lot, where they're like, oh, this account's using like pictures of ancient Roman monuments to push this. And like, I don't know. I'm sure that does happen sometimes too. I've never personally been accused of that, but I'm just saying I have seen that. So I think there is that where they feel like the misuse of history can be a huge flashpoint for some people. But again, not a personal experience of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Andrew. I guess I see sort of a couple, not getting too specific or drilling down or naming individuals, right? I could see a couple sort of broad trends that sort of lead to some clashes. So, on our side of it, on the academic side of it, I'd be lying if I said there weren't some professors that probably have a desire to sort of gatekeep, is the terminology we use in academia, right? They're sort of putting up a fence around what they see as, quote, their thing, and saying, well, you're not in our fence, you're not in our thing, so you're doing it wrong, or you're not allowed to do it, or something like that. I think there is definitely some of that coming from our side, from the academic side. I like to think that it's not all of us. I'm absolutely sure it's not all of us, because I know it's not me, and I highly doubt it's John. But I do see that coming from some of my colleagues within the academic side. So a desire to gatekeep. But then I think you also have sort of a contrary desire on the enthusiast side, right? Some enthusiasts sort of want to appear to be sort of the righteous rebels bucking against a corrupt institution, right? They sort of think this is like, oh, we're kicking back against the man. We're sort of burning down like this corrupt ivory tower. And I think we see that a lot more maybe within the sort of archaeology side than on the history side right now. Like the archaeology war is really hot right now on social media, right? Between professional academic archaeologists and these sort of pop enthusiast archaeologists who have these, various theories about how, from everything to how the pyramids were built to whether there was a real Atlantis, that kind of thing, right? That's sort of one of those examples I'm thinking of. And I think more broadly, we can't ignore what Andrew sort of alluded to at the end there, which is that there's probably certain ideological considerations to this debate, right? Without getting into too many specifics, right? There's probably some right-left divide on how history is approached and how each side or individuals within each side think history should be approached that leads to some tension. So that maybe was an overall too vague answer, but we could get into more specifics in a minute if we want to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in both of what you're saying, both what both of you have said. I think we academics, we spend so much time obsessing over the details and reading everything and talking about things like historiography, which, you put that title, you put that word in the name of a book and it's just a killer. It's a sales killer instantly, right? This is not something that the general public, but if you see somebody say, well, here's an account and they're saying, oh, well, Andrew, you mentioned the 1453, right? Well, this is what was going on in 1453. And somebody says, don't they realize that view was put forward in the 1930s and it was shot down in 1942, obviously, right? And everybody knows this. And we've now moved on to this. And it's almost like there's like a resentment, like, why don't the public know the things that we know to be true in reality? And it's a ridiculous standard, because why would they? Right? There's no reason for them to know those things, right? The things we talk about, like, oh, remember when the Annalise School was all about social history? Nobody out there talks about that stuff. And so I suspect we have colleagues who get frustrated by saying what they see as a lack of expertise, but a lack of awareness of where a topic has been, where it is, and where it's going. And so someone comes in and says, so-and-so did this. And you say, we've known for 20 years they didn't. People say, well, don't they know? Right. And there's this impatience with it. I've always thought of those things. Those are sort of teaching moments where our job should be to say, that's really interesting. People used to think that for a long time. Have you ever read this book? This is the one that kind of challenged that idea. You might want to take a look at it. Right. Instead of saying, you idiot, haven't you read anything? You don't know, right? Instead, you take it and say, no, these are, people who are just getting into the subject, or, and they only have, as we talked about, limited hours during the day. And so I think there's a frustration there. Academics, this is a huge generalization, and a lot of people would punch me for this. Sort of the academic punch way, right? Not the brutal way. if you go to like an academic conference, and David, you got to back me up here, right? And you go to like a cocktail hour, it's like a middle school dance, right? I mean, everybody's standing against the walls, clutching their drink, not sure if they really want to talk to this person or that, right? There's a general social awkwardness. I mean, academia self-selects to some degree of people who just are different interpersonally. They dive into research. They're alone in archives. They're just a little different, right? And so it's really funny when you go to the Society of Military History. I think it's hilarious. You just look around and you're like, oh, come on, people, just go up and just say hi, right? Well, now translate that to the social media sphere, right? Just have a conversation about the history, and you say sometimes that's hard to pull off because where they are and what they do in their job, where they are in their life, how they, who they're surrounded by, how they interact. And I think personality has a lot to do with it at the end of the day. And like I said, I see these as teaching moments. The other one, and I was thinking about this when David first pitched the panel, is academics are trained to save the grand pronouncements for like later in your career when you're a senior scholar, right? So I see, so like Michael, to go on, kind of what you put on X sometimes, right? Or I've seen some of the accounts that we both follow, right? Who is the greatest medieval general, or who was better, this person or this, or what was the greatest battle, right? And, this kind of, which it sounds like, some of that is post-engagement, right? Get the algorithm cranking and get people, interested. We, if you look through one of our books, you'll see the words, perhaps, seems to have been, appears, right? We couch everything we do with escape valves so we can get out of it if somebody really challenges us, right? Because there's always maybe that one source we never got to that disproves our whole thesis. And so we have to be very, very careful, right? I think after you do that for a few years, someone who comes across and is prepared to stake a claim like that, instantly what goes through our heads is the 100 exceptions and the 100 counter arguments. And how could you possibly do that? And it's like, does not compute, circuits breaking, right? We want to be slow and cautious and small much of the time. And I think what I see on accounts that have a lot of followers, right? They make these kind of grand pronouncements, these grand gestures, right? I remember looking at your thread, Michael, about the Gothic architecture, right? About, who built these churches and why, right? And you took a big stab at it and you made a declaration, and people are going to go, no, I've read that, I've read these architectural accounts, and you don't talk about the role of scholasticism, and you and they want to find caveats to everything. And this is how we're trained. And so I think, what would be useful is having more people, and maybe we can get into this a little later, having us mix more often, frankly. When I was at Leeds, David and I were at the conference in Leeds a few weeks ago. I was hanging out with medievalist.net, Peter and Sandra. I go way back with those guys, like 20 years, right? And they're not professors. And we were just hanging out at dinner, and we were just talking shop, and it was great, and the more of that, realizing, and they were telling me, well, this is why we take this approach. Oh, that's kind of interesting. I never really thought about it like that. I think the more of that you get into, but if you don't have that, it's really like two worlds colliding. And not everybody handles that in the right way. It does make me wonder, and I've thought this more than once, when you see very combative professors like this who lose it and get very upset at amateur pop accounts, it always makes me wonder how they teach, like how they relate to their students, because who do you think their students are? The students are novices in history who don't know and are going to be wondering the same things. And I hope that they don't treat their students like they treat people on the internet.
That's a good point I hadn't considered about how your training is designed to the escape valve and the sort of thinking of all of the facts, if you will, as a shorthand of sort of maybe summing up what you said there. Because as you say, the point of that post is to start a discussion, essentially. So, there are, and that's, in a way, I feel a little bit sad for my detractors, I suppose, because in a way, that's like the purpose. That's how you get people to look at your stuff, is by starting a discussion. And I do my best. I attempt to do that in good faith, to of course be respectful to the professionals and be open to correction or input or any sort of clarification or anything. And of course, those things are opportunities for professionals or people who know more than me to chime in and say, actually, have you considered this? Or what about this person said about this? Or, whatever. Actually, this is something that was 50 years ago. Anything of that, I'm totally open to. And so, I do my best to sort of, as Andrew said, to be deferential to the professionals, if you will, because I realize that there's a whole, of course, not just time and years, but expertise in sort of going through the sources and things like that and understanding the facts. And I feel a strong responsibility to be factual. But of course, the reality just of social media is that, if I were to write a 5,000 word post about the construction of the cathedrals, nobody would read it. Nobody would care. And it would be pointless to write that on X or on Substack. So that's sort of, it's sort of, there is a little bit of a conflict, I suppose, just in the nature of the things there. And so, and the other thing too, is that I try my best to be respectful and open to correction, because I do want the things that I'm saying to be correct, at least in part. And I do want professionals to be able to chime in and add other things. Some of the most interesting things that I've learned have been from professionals, or even just people who know much more than me, who have chimed in on a post and said, actually, it's kind of like this, and here's a source that says this and these other things. And you can learn something really cool from that. And so there can be a lot of actual education that comes from those types of things. Another thing that the gatekeeping comment made me think about was, and it just occurred to me as you were saying this, that history, it seems to me that history is used sometimes in particular ways as justification for various things. And so there may be some motivations for, your particular beliefs, whoever's particular beliefs, to have some sort of opinion about history accepted as correct, because that gives you some sort of justification about some other thing. And so I think maybe there's some sort of conflict between the sides, if you will, over arguments of justification, or potential desire to use history in a particular way. I just came up with it right now, so it's not really it just came to me right now, so it's not really a refined thought. If anybody has anything on that or anything else.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's fair to say that all historians are people, right? At the end of the day, so there's great variety, but I think some academic historians probably approach history ideologically, in the sense that they are looking for confirmation of their sort of current sort of belief system, whatever that is, whether it's a political one or an economic one, in the study of the past, right? So we see this happening with declaring certain things in the modern political climate fascism, and certain interest in ancient or medieval history as fascism, or go the other way, right? Historians that are ideologically motivated by being anti-capitalist or socialist are interested in sort of showing the ways that monetary motivation or interest or labor history has affected the past, right? So they approach it ideologically that way. So this goes back to approaching history with a theory and then trying to stuff history into that theory. And if they see enthusiasts not interacting with the past the way they do, not trying to fit it into their ideological molds, it can set off certain opinions, right? Certain strong opinions. I think that's one potential issue that's occasionally encountered. I certainly don't think that's the majority of academic historians, but as we know, social media gives powerful microphones to those who make the loudest complaints.
One thing I noticed, you said, like, they'll see someone and say, "Oh, you didn't, apply these strict standards, and you made these grand pronouncements." But then I noticed that sometimes I'll be like, you just made a grand pronouncement about this person based on like the pictures they posted and a few things that definitely don't explicitly say what you're saying, but you're making an explicit claim that they're, insert ism of some kind, depending what it is. Um, it could be racism, whatever it is. And like of course that does happen on X. We all know that as well. So I'm not going to say that there are real cases that happens, and I'm not, but I do think there's these times where I'm like, if you're going to make a grand claim, kind of need that evidence and it's not there. But there also is a thing where people just say like, oh, I don't like your view, so you're like a deep state historian basically, or something, like, you're trying to guard the secrets from us, like as if as if most of these historians at least don't want to also know these juicy details to about whatever it is, ancient Egypt, whatever's, like they want to know probably more than you since they're so invested in this. There might be a few gatekeepers, but a lot of them really want to know. So I think there's like these weird mutual suspicions, and like you're kind of making a caricature of the other side sometimes. Again, I don't think I get involved that much in this, but that's my observer point of view.
I think that's a great point. The hypocrisy abounds, right? It's all over how dare you make this grand pronouncement? And I'm now going to denounce you and everybody else who liked this post. And it gets petty very quick. And if you haven't heard the old proverb about academics, right, that the politics are so vicious because the stakes are so small. The things that we get grief over, these are not things that are going to contribute to the general welfare of the American public. But we get very invested in them. And I know, speaking just personally, I've had my X account for, I don't know, it's been a long time, right? I hardly have any followers. I mean, just because I decided from the beginning, said, I'm just not going to do politics. I'm just not going to get into any of that stuff. And I just refuse. I hate it. It just infects everything. And you can see the results, right? Like nobody follows me because there's nothing controversial. And then you look at some of these, some of our colleagues from these schools, and not even the top flight schools. It's unbelievable. I mean, 200, 300,000 people following them. And I'll look and I'll say, okay, it's an associate professor of history at so-and-so who works on this. How in the world did they get such a following? And then you look at the post and you look at the replies in particular, like, oh, they're fighting every day. They're out there fighting their fights. And I think it's corrosive. I won't take part in it, but I won't deny, that there's a lot of piling on, like you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it'd be better if, like, when I'm looking at a historian, like, I mean, do what you want in your personal life, but like, and I don't even care, honestly. But like, it'd be better if, in most cases, like, we didn't know who you voted for. That's why I try not to make posts. Like, I'm not gonna ever say like who I voted for or like other stuff, because my people don't follow me for that. Or I don't post about Israel and Palestine again. It's like, it's not like I don't have opinions. Like, it's not like I don't know what's going on in the world, whatever. But it's like, that's not what I'm here for. And like, I probably could get more engagement by doing that, but I don't know. It's just not. Also, I don't really want that in my comments, and I don't really want to engage with it. And it's just not worth it to make like a little more money and get a little more buzz for that.
You're too nice, Andrew. You got to fight with more people. Fight me online. Let's fight. Alexios is terrible.
Oh, well, we can fight about that. That's legitimate arena right there. We can fight about that. I don't think you really.
It's just a grand pronouncement. So. I got to make a grand pronouncement. I'm gonna, as soon as this is over, I'm making the big tweet. All right. So how can we better communicate and collaborate? Because I think it's fair to say that even from the enthusiast or pop historian perspective, we obviously have a lot of things in common. We have a lot of, I think, similar goals, similar desires, and certainly similar interests. So how can the two sides, if you will, communicate and collaborate better, David?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the how to communicate better part. I think the number one easiest thing that we can all do, right, is simply to extend a little bit more grace to one another, which is hard in this social media world in which most of us are interacting, right? But avoiding the temptation to dunk on somebody else's hot take, especially in a virulent kind of way, I think would be a great starting point, right? If we can avoid labeling people based on a one sentence take, if we can avoid, responding to a one sentence take with a 1,000 word article, if we can avoid insinuating that an entire group is somehow illegitimate or engaged in a cover up or corrupt. these are minor things that I think we could do that'll help with communication. But I think on a deeper level, for more collaboration, what we need is simply more time talking to one another, like we're doing right here in this podcast discussion, or like John was saying he did at the conference with the people that run medievalists.net. So a couple of ways that I think about this. I think it'd be great if we had some kind of organization that we all belonged to. Now, there are a variety of academic historical associations that one can be a part of. So John mentioned the Society of Military History earlier. There's the American Historical Association, but these are primarily associations for academic historians, maybe occasionally secondary school teachers as well, but they don't really draw in enthusiasts. So some kind of a organization or club that both enthusiast historians and professional historians join, and that they can interact with each other in, would, I think, be useful. I don't know what exactly that looks like, but this is pie in the sky thinking. And then maybe as an offshoot of that organization or that club, maybe setting up some kind of partnerships would be really interesting. Pair one enthusiast with one academic historian for a year's worth of collaboration, where they, get each other's contact information. They can set up meetings if they want to, or at least send emails back and forth, talk about what they're doing, share tips. The enthusiasts share tips on social media engagement. The, academic historians share tips on the historiography they've read and how that might be interesting, right? I think just talking with one another like that would be really valuable to better enhancing the collaboration between the enthusiast and the professional side.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think we, as professional historians, I think there's an ethical obligation, at least this is my perception of us to help people who are not necessarily even our students. If there are people who are curious about history and we have something that can help them, we can help guide them, and we need to be doing it. We do. And if you come and, certainly if somebody asks for materials, I think, Michael, once you asked for me for an article or two on something, and it's like, yeah, well, sure. Yeah. Here's the titles. Here's some places to look, right? That kind of thing, I think is a good way to build bridges. I have one that might be a little controversial. I'm not sure if we have enough time left to dive into this, and I don't want to offend anybody, but one of the things I've noticed in the discourse as you see these arguments rage, right? We have not mentioned this yet. The tendency, it seems to me, for a lot of the more pop historians, as you call them, to have anonymous handles. And I know why. I think there's a good reason for it. On the other hand, I'm sure we've all seen the tweet that's like, okay, Anon, sure, anonymous person, I'm sure you have something to say to the professor of so-and-so, right? I just think if there is kind of a name basis, I think it might help to know, because I know certainly I put up something about, what was it, about Henry V a couple months ago, and French guy just jumped down my throat, and it was fine. I'm like, I don't even know your name, right? And I'm happy. And he's like, what's your source? And, what are you looking at? It's like, I'm happy to provide all those things, but I don't even know who you are, right? If they say, well, I'm an undergrad at so-and-so and I'm really interested. Oh, fantastic, right? Just even if I'm not suggesting last names or anything, but just something to kind of personalize if it's going to be an interpersonal relationship, if the scholars are out there with their names and with their positions and with their websites and that sort of stuff, anything an anonymous account can do within their comfort level to to enable the personalization. I'm just wondering if that might help a lot, because it's a lot harder to tear somebody down when they've got a name going. It's just an anonymous person with swords in their handles and lots of emojis and a flag of a nation or something. People, oh, well, you've got that flag. Well, I'm going to assume this about you and stuff. And I don't know. It just crossed my mind. I'd be interested in what you, Andrew, and Michael have to say about that from your perspective.
I have mixed feelings. I think that there's a couple reasons. I think when I first started doing this, it seems like, I mean, I don't think I do anything particularly edgy, but the problem is he seems to be moving goalposts on what is acceptable and what's not. So there's something that could be acceptable now, and in 5 years, people decide it's not, and it could somehow relate to what you do outside of this because of some new theory that got applied and became mainstream, and you no longer conform to that. Again, probably with the history I do, that's not so much of a thing. It's probably not a major aspect, but I also like the nationalism is a problem for me. So there's like just some really charged nationalists, and like I get a really good variety pack of those. So I get people who, say they're Turkish and they say, "Oh, we're gonna come invade your country," which they think I live in Greece, I guess, and they're gonna take over a country. I'm like, okay, well, that's not gonna happen because that's not my country, and that's not gonna happen. I mean, I don't think either of those things will happen, but whatever. But I also get people. I've had Greek people think that because I call them Romans, that I'm actually I'm a secret Albanian or Turk or something. That's like I'm trying to undermine their history. I've had actual like Albanians, I had Serbians, all kinds of different people, and like I've gotten messages where they're like, "We're gonna come conquer you." It's like they're pretty aggressive sometimes, and I'm like, I'm like, I don't know. Maybe these people would try to find my information if they had like some breadcrumbs to work with. I don't know. I mean, I don't mind putting my first name again. There's a lot of Andrews out there. That's not too much, but more than that, I'm not sure. Like, it's tough because the personalization aspect. But in terms of like overall collaboration, to get back to that topic, I do think one of the best things that we could do is like, you guys work in a little bit more of a closed world. You work in the university. I can't just roll up there and be like, "Hey guys, I'm going to take part of this." But the social media stuff is open, and I wish more professors would be on there. I mean, I understand if you're like professor emeritus and you're like, I don't know if I want to learn how to do Twitter. I get that, but like some people, like it would be nice if they were on there. And I do think the politics thing has gotten in the way. I think there were more professors before. I've noticed less of them because they've gone to like Blue Sky and stuff, and now because of they don't like Elon Musk, I guess. Which like I don't care if you like Elon Musk. I mean, there's some good and some bad things about what's happened on the platform for sure. But now it's like if they would have put the history first, I think they would still be on X because they would be reaching more people. Now you're reaching 13 people, and yeah, they're gonna maybe believe more of what you believe. But like you lost the reach, and I don't know. I think convincing one person you disagree with is worth more than just telling 13 people who already see it that way to keep seeing it that way. So I think I wish that they would be a little more involved, get part of the world, and that like you don't have to like. I know you don't have unlimited time. You don't have 2 hours a day to be posting, but like just some minor relationship building, and it could benefit professors as well in terms of like having a network to get awareness when their book comes out, or if they go on a podcast, it's a network to get that podcast awareness and like supercharge that. Like it's just like so it has benefits for both sides. It would humanize both sides, and I think it's cool if like I write a post that they're like, well, I think Justinian overextended a little bit. And they're like, well, did you really think about this? Did you think about the fact that it actually went wrong more after Justinian died? I work on this all the time. Here's what I think. And you're like, oh, well, that is a valid take. So like it would enrich everything. And I think as long as it's done in a respectful way, it would just be beneficial. But like more interaction on social media would be good.
When Nicephorus focus becomes the next National Socialist symbol, your account is going to be in big trouble. Yeah, I think I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but I think my podcast is an attempt to do that. To, of course, pay some deferential respect to the professionals and experts who know a lot more than I do, and to help boost them. I think just sort of the good faith on both sides, certainly as John has mentioned, treating the professionals with some respect is a good thing, that everybody should perhaps practice a little bit more. But of course, if somebody, whether they're a professional historian or I suppose just a random person who thinks that I am a Nazi, then I suppose maybe all good faith is already out the window. because full transparency, I'm not a Nazi. I don't believe in Nazism. But I suppose, just generally, I think approaching the discussions with a little more good faith. The Anon thing is very interesting. Of course, anybody who's going to be on social media, I guess, with any sort of controversial view, I suppose, or the hard part is, as Andrew said, is that what is a controversial view is sort of always moving, and so you don't really know if what you say is going to be controversial, like I suppose tomorrow or next year. As I sort of just joked with Nicephorus Phocas, he could become the next, the original. He could be the OG Hitler, according to the next theory. That'll be the next PhD theory, how Nicephorus Phocas was the OG Hitler. And then what happens? People can try to get your personal information or ruin your life and all these other types of things. So there are sort of those considerations, I suppose, that that people take into consideration when deciding whether they're going to be anonymous or not. I do agree with you, though, John, that being anonymous, respectfully, Andrew, of course, but being anonymous sort of does lessen the impact of whatever you have to say in general, because anybody can sort of say anything. So I do kind of agree with that, and I've had an anonymous account before, and I've had that in mind before, because you don't know who somebody is. I mean, an anonymous account, I mean, it could be Elon's burner. You don't know. Elon could be talking to me on Twitter. I don't know, but it also, I mean, I've had anonymous accounts that, come in saying, well, you don't know this. And I'll look at it and it's like 3 followers, account was started 2 months ago, this and that. And it's like, I don't know, man. Like, why do I care about your questions? Are you a real person? Are you somebody who matters? Like, what's going on here? Like, it kind of doesn't, like, I'm happy to talk with anybody about anything, but there's sort of if you don't really know who you're talking to, it sort of lessens the impact. Or, if you don't know who you're getting information from, it sort of lessens the impact in a way. And now, of course, for example, like with your account, Andrew, that obviously is mitigated over time. Somebody knows, obviously, seeing your account over time, that they can trust you and use site sources and all these types of things. So that can sort of be mitigated by time. But there, I guess everybody sort of has to decide sort of that thing for themselves. And I definitely agree with you. I see that a lot now, where I look at something and I just clicked on something the other day. I can't remember what it was. And I clicked on it, and it said something like, now you can find us on Blue Sky. And I was just like, man, why you gotta be doing that? It's just a real shame. And I think that I don't know, whatever, I guess, everybody has to sort of make their own choices. People can make their own choice to go to Blue Sky, just like people can make their own choice to be anonymous. But at the end of the day, I guess, we sort of have to just decide where we're going to fit in. But I think more collaborations and communications and just sort of the expectation of good faith is certainly a place to start.
Yeah, I think there's a general problem that it's very trendy to just not trust authority in general. And yeah, I think that it makes people like a little bit, it loses the good faith. That goes a lot of ways. I mean, there's people who I'll literally get it from a primary source, and they'll just be like, well, I just asked Grok and it said something different. I'm like, well, it probably doesn't have that primary source, honestly, like unless you uploaded it to it, which I doubt you did. I mean, I literally quoted a primary source once, and then they asked Grok and it quoted a different part. Like, I don't know where it got it from that primary source. I'm like, well, if you trust that person, like that's who I quoted. And they're like, nuh-uh. I'm like, come on. So I don't know. Like, maybe that's one of those things that will pass over time, that like being anti-authority is very trendy right now too. I mean, so we'll see. But if we could, always work on good faith. I try to have it. So.
Yeah, I think part of working on good faith is that if you choose to remain anonymous, having some degree of understanding for those who are not anonymous, because there's a differential involved there, right? Like if an account is anonymous and my account is very much not, I'm a public figure, it's my real name on my account, You can Google my real name, find my university webpage very easily. Like none of this is secret. There's a differential there between me and anonymous accounts. So, right, like showing some awareness of that. And I'm not going to judge you for being anonymous as long as you're not going to use who I am against me, right? In the same way that you wouldn't want me to find out who you are and use it against you. I think that goes a little bit of a ways to helping to bridge that gap between anonymity and sort of being fully known.
I think maybe a little bit of that difference is that for a professional historian, theoretically, any historical opinions or sort of related that you post online would not have professional consequences, because I'm assuming that you could say to your university that, oh, well, this is, I'm doing history on the internet, I guess. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's, whereas like for obviously just the random poster, there's potentially more at stake, but feel free to correct me on that, I suppose.
No, you just made me think of something I neglected to do, because that is the boat I'm in exactly. And so I have to say right now that all the views I expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the Department of Defense, because we do have that. We do have the scrutiny when we go out. And I've been at events before. I got driven off the stage at an event here in Kansas City a couple of years ago by protesters who were assuming that I was speaking for the Pentagon, right? And we hadn't even had a chance to say we're not speaking for the Pentagon, right? But there is sometimes that presumption there. And certainly you see that in news cycles. Professor at Harvard says something and, we'll attack Harvard, right? Because this professor said it. There is that burden to try to be responsible out in the public sphere. I mean, you have to do it. This is what I'm thinking. This is what I have researched and that sort of thing. But also be respectful. I mean, I'm not, the Army conditions, I have to put disclaimers on everything I do. At the same time, we all sign a computer policy. Everybody in the federal government does. We are not allowed to be abusive online. I mean, it's actually, if you ever get in a screaming match with a federal employee and they're harassing you, you might want to ask if they signed the agreement. We are technically not allowed to do that. And maybe if everybody just kind of minded their P's and Q's and played by the rules that they're given, and some of this stuff would go away. I'm sure that, when I worked, my old job was at a state university in Baltimore. I don't recall having any such prohibition put on me when I was a tenured professor there, but I'm sure there are other schools that have similar sort of codes. I'm thinking particularly of private schools, liberal arts colleges that have certain expectations for how people should behave in public, including social media.
And I imagine you guys, if you say something now, again, the goalpost can move. So if you said something a little edgy, but it was fine right now, in 5 years, it could become trendy and like, whoa, do you remember when looks like in 2025, they said this? I mean, isn't that crazy? And then now the university may have never cared now, but then they're looking like, well, it's making us look bad. I don't know. And then now it's, for you guys, it's like a lot more at stake in that way. I mean, again, if you conduct yourself in a certain way, it probably won't happen. But for people who are, I guess, using those freedoms to the max, they have to worry a little more, I guess.
Well, we're a certain degree shielded by the very nature of our subject, right? There's not a lot of hot button topics in ancient or medieval history that are going to make people mad at us. I think this is something that I worry a lot more about if I worked on, modern U.S. history or modern European history. That would be a concern. And certainly it's the case that, generally speaking, we don't really have anything to fear about expressing our opinion about the history we study. But it's certainly possible for people to write letters and demand you to be fired for you expressing other types of opinions. It's not unheard of. I'll just put it that way. So that's why a lot of us, John and I both, it sounds like, are very careful to limit ourselves on social media to talking about history and what we do, rather than talking about any other sort of modern controversies.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I would just caution you, David, don't ever make the mistake I made and write a book about Jerusalem, because you find out very quickly. I had to learn how to use my mute and block functions robustly just all of a sudden, I'm like, what is this? I was not used to it at all. But yeah, you're right. In general, the things we talk about, there are some things you can put your finger on and say, okay, that's controversial. But in general, we're in fairly safe ground. At least in our country, people don't even know the last 100 years of history, or even the last 50, much less 1,000 years ago.
Let me just throw one thing in that we didn't get to in the discussion. I think it's worth throwing in somewhere, and that is that professional academic historians are actually a rare breed and slowly dying out. I think that's probably worth saying. It is a concern in the United States that there are so few of us and that fewer jobs are advertised every year. I'll just throw out one statistic for you. The Medieval Academy of America, which is the Association of Medieval Historians, did a study since the COVID pandemic and found that there's been about an average of 5 medieval history jobs advertised in the entire country for medieval history professors every year. So every year, only 5 people start as a medieval historian at some university in the United States. So when we're talking about professional historians and medieval history, we're talking about an increasingly small number of people, and so it's important for us as medieval historians to make our case to the general public about why what we do matters. And to hopefully not alienate the people that are interested in medieval history along with us. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought it was worth mentioning.
And I would just like to say that when I make content, part of the reason I like to source books is that if somebody was like, oh, this is really interesting, I can go find it. I mean, sometimes it's primary source and it's cool if they go explore that. But also sometimes I'm like, there's certain books you really like and you're like, well, hopefully someone does go buy it and become more interested in history. And then again, if more people are interested in history, there'll be more potentially people who study it or are more interested in it, even taking electives in it when they go. I mean, I think, on our side of things, just generating more societal interest in history can't be a negative pressure, I think, on, of course, the field of history. So I wish more people would be interested in it for sure. I think it's important, but I do see that. That's part of why I didn't go down the history path, even though I was tempted to. It just looked a little scary. And it looks like it's panned out that way since that decision, unfortunately. So,
well, if there's 5 jobs and there's only 2 professional historians here, that's 3 jobs for you, Andrew. So, I think that in a way, this is in a big part why our interests are synergized. Because I think, if we didn't really get into it, but, humanities funding and history and, jobs, obviously. And then, for historians, you have to make a living. That could be book sales. That can be, various other means. And as we already discussed, you don't have the time, in large part, to be a big time social media influencer. So, I think that we have a lot of synergy where we can work together in those types of things. Because certainly, the work that we've discussed, the work that you're doing is very valuable, and the stuff that Andrew and I do to get people interested, get more people into history, get more people reading history, get more people wanting to learn history, certainly does a service, I think, in helping that sort of sentiment, public sentiment, if you will. And so, I think that there's definitely a back and forth, historians being accessible, such as you gentlemen coming on the podcast today, which I appreciate. And so thank you. That obviously is, let's say, good for me. And then hopefully the stuff that I'm doing is in return good for you. And the stuff that all of us are doing is in turn very good for history. So I think that we have a very synergized interest, if you will, if I'm using that word correctly. I went to art school.
Absolutely. I think if there's anything we take away from this discussion is that there's a lot more that unites academic historians and enthusiast historians than divides them, right? We all have an interest in spreading the study of history and getting more people to pay attention to our particular fields of history that we like.
That concludes this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to let us know what you think, please do so in the comments, or you can do so under the note or the post on Substack. And don't forget, you can find the links to everyone's social media accounts and to the gentleman's books in the description. And I am going to have several very great episodes coming up for you shortly, and I have several more scheduled to record before the end of the year, many more great episodes. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider becoming a paid supporter of the show on Substack. That is what is going to enable me to keep bringing you these kinds of podcasts, as well as bigger and better projects long into the future.